Hi, everyone. Thanks very much, Tim. Um, are my slides up now? How do I see those? There we go. Okay. Hi, everyone. Like Tim mentioned, I lead the agriculture and food portfolio at RBC Thought Leadership. And in my role, I kind of straddle two different worlds. So, really focus on research and providing independent, applied research within the context of agriculture, covering a range of different topics from trade to climate, but then also lead a lot of our stakeholder engagement and sector alliance work, driving forward conversations that are action orientated, and then putting our research insights into practical, real solutions that drive the industry forward. And I can get into more of that in future slides. So, next slide, please. So, within our portfolio, we have sector verticals. So I lead our agriculture and food. It's really defined as what are the key priority sectors within the Canadian economy that can drive prosperity, that can drive growth. So I have a counterpart that works in the building sector, another that works in the energy sector, transportation sector, and we work across a number of key themes. So geopolitics is very top of mind, particularly in regards to trade. So advancing our insights on that topic. Growth and productivity, trying to better understand the intersect between human capital and disruptive technologies and how that actually can feed into our growth and productivity and where there are key opportunities within sectors to unlock our potential. And then climate action and sustainability are very important to RBC and to RBC Thought Leadership. And because of that, in 2023, we established the Climate Action Institute, which is an institute housed within the RBC Thought Leadership group and really focuses on what does climate action look like within Canada from not only an emissions perspective and emissions from an absolute intensity perspective, but policy, industry action, consumer sentiment, disruptive technologies, and capital. Like, where is the investment coming from, public or private, and how is it being mobilized within key economic sectors? Next slide, please. And like I mentioned, agriculture and food is certainly a really big priority for us, and we lean into that quite heavily in terms of our research and in our engagement. A lot of this was really spurred by one particular report called Farmer 4.0, which was released around 6 or 7 years ago, and it really tried to focus on what are the skills that farmers and those in a farmer's ecosystem, whether it's their financial advisor, their agronomist, or even kind of further down the value chain and in terms of a processor, what types of skills will they need, recognizing that new technologies are coming on board and disrupting the labor market? And how do we help the Canadian agri-food sector integrate those tools and those new skills to really grow and thrive as a sustainable, productive industry? Last year, the trade disruptions and discussions with the US, with China, with other large superpowers around the world really drove us to dig into where Canada sits in terms of a trade growth and diversification lens for agri-food and where the growth opportunities are. So that's in our Food First research. And then just last fall, we released some work called The Next Generation of Growth. And that really dug into the skills and talent and R&D challenges that are really holding innovation back in the Canadian agri-food sector. Next slide, please. So our work does not happen just behind a desk on Bay Street. We are out and engaged with our stakeholders. I'm currently in Alberta, engaging with RBC's really leaders in terms of agricultural operations. And we do this on a weekly basis, making sure that what we're producing is informed by the industry and really helps advance those discussions. So we've done some work on greenhouses. We really tried to better understand the ecosystem within Leamington and what is happening that really has created a special place for greenhouses to be growing and being a national and even global example of what productivity looks like. We've visited and engaged with the University of Manitoba several times, and they're part of our RBC Generate program, where we're really trying to help advance investments for the next generation of growth. And our CEO, Dave Mackay, agri-food and soil health in particular is a really interesting topic for him, and is why he's so engaged in CANZA, which is the Canadian Alliance for Net Zero Agri-Food. Next slide, please. So getting into the research and what we're seeing. So every year, the Climate Action Institute, it releases a report called Climate Action, and it's named after the year that it's released in, and it's really focused on what did climate action look like in the year that happened, and how does that compare to the years before? What trends are we seeing? Where is progress slipping and where is it growing? And to produce this report, there's about 20 people that are engaged from a research, economics, policy analyst perspective to graphic designers and communication experts that really try to move this forward so that we have a really strong foundation for having productive conversations around climate action in Canada's key economic sectors. So some of the key tools and research methods that we use to inform that work, which I'll provide some more insight on, is that we engage in over 150 business executives across Canada to understand kind of where they're seeing their climate and their sustainability strategies evolve. Where are they focusing action? Are they sticking to targets? Those types of discussions. Then we have a fairly large consumer-focused survey to understand where is the Canadian sentiment on climate action, and where is there kind of a difference between intent and actual climate action behavior, and how is climate actually showing up in people's lives. And this may be no surprise to many of you, but over the last 3 years, it's really been about how during wildfire seasons, the impacts of climate change have had a direct impact on people's personal health, personal well-being, and their daily lives in terms of just physically being outside. And so starting to see climate action kind of transform into more of a concern around climate adaptation, given that the effects are having an immediate impact. And then we also have a few other key pieces that we try to communicate climate action within each sector. So we do case studies on interesting stories within each sector. For agriculture, it was the Trusted Advisors program that is growing throughout the Prairie provinces, where we focused on kind of looking at agronomists as a lever to help expand sustainable practices and integrating sustainable practices into farm management. And then from a national view, we have our Climate Action Barometer that really tries to pull together a national picture of what climate action looks like. And then we dive into each sector through indexes to really try to hone in on where we're seeing action in the sector to inform decisions in the year ahead. Next slide, please. So from this research, there have been a number of really interesting insights that have come out from this work that was published in Climate Action 2026. But just on Monday, we also published a shorter piece called What We Heard, because after we published this report, and if you read it, or if you're going to read it, you're going to see that climate action has dropped between 24 and 25. And there's a number of reasons why. There was policy changes, there was capital flow declines, there was consumer sentiment declines. And all this added up to the first time we've actually seen climate action drop in Canada since 2019. But we wanted to know a little bit more about why that's happening, where it's headed, and if we can expect changes to be made in 2026 and where there are key opportunities. So encourage you all to look that up. It's on our Climate Action Institute website. And it really showcases what we've heard from leaders in the federal government, provincial governments, and in companies and industry associations as well. But I think one thing to recognize within this conversation of climate action declining between 2024 and 2025 is that there's still a lot of capital on the table to be deployed and drive climate action in the Canadian context. Based on our estimates, looking out to 2035, there's nearly $100 billion that are dedicated to climate action, whether it's through tax incentives, whether it's through programming and policy. There is a lot of money on the table, but the key challenge there is deploying that capital in an accessible way to actually drive action. So we heard from a lot of different industry stakeholders recently around some challenges in terms of accessing that capital because of granting restrictions, because of how innovation is defined in a certain program. And so we've really tried to hone in on where are those opportunities and shared what we heard to key decision makers. In terms of existing climate capital flow annually from a public and private perspective, it's hovering around $20 billion in Canada. That is impressive, but that's also not enough in terms of actually mobilizing the climate action we need to reach targets like net zero by 2050 and what that could actually look like in terms of an investment pathway. In terms of consumers, like I mentioned, we saw sentiment decline. But I think what is maybe more interesting is the fact that while big issues like national security and national sovereignty, affordability, these types of issues have really been very top of mind for Canadians over the last year. When we looked into the data, for roughly 33% of Canadians, climate is still in the top 3 priorities that they want action on. So even though it's slipped, it's still a really big issue for a lot of people. So that I think is really motivating for businesses and governments in terms of actually driving forward climate competitiveness strategies and moving forward in terms of focusing on the doable in the short term. And then maybe just one last point just on that actually is when we engage with businesses for this research, Climate Action 2026, and in follow-up conversations, what we heard is that there was a lot of headline targets made between 2020, 2023, in terms of what the climate ambition would be for looking out to 2030 and 2050. And while there are some rollbacks and there are some modifications to those targets, what we are seeing is that that's not actually a signal of inaction or not staying the course on action, but rather focusing on the doable in the short term and really driving efficiencies, driving short-term investments that have real tangible impacts, and focusing less on making really big, ambitious targets and announcements. And I think that's quite interesting to be tracking and to be thinking about, given that when we see climate change kind of fall in terms of the broader discussion, what we hear from industry leaders is that it's still a priority. It's just maybe being framed a little bit differently than what we saw in maybe 2020. Next slide, please. So this is our climate action barometer. This is our national view of what climate action looks like in Canada. As you can see, we're tracking policy decisions, policy implementation, capital, industry action, which means the actual actions that are aligned to the emissions reduction potential within an industry that can drive emissions down from either an intensity perspective or an absolute perspective. Consumer action. So are they investing in EVs? Are they purchasing heat pumps? Are they reducing their consumption? Those types of things is what we're surveying and looking at. And then technologies in terms of their readiness to be deployed in a sector and how much impact they're actually having in terms of disrupting emissions and driving reductions. And then, of course, we look at emissions. We look at emissions from an absolute perspective, from an NIR view, but then we also look at it from an intensity perspective in terms of GDP for this national index. And as you can see, what I mentioned earlier is that between 2024 and 2025, it is that first year that we've seen that decline in climate action. But if you look back to 2019, based on our estimates, emissions intensity has dropped by 15%, and total absolute emissions have dropped by 7%. Next slide, please. So this conversation is obviously focused on agriculture, so I'll only provide a deep dive on our agricultural findings, but just wanted to highlight that we also are looking at climate action through buildings, electricity, heavy industry, oil and gas, and transportation as well. Next slide, please. So this is the result of our agricultural index in terms of looking at, again, policy, capital, action, and emissions. Emissions for our sectors, it's tied to the actual production or output of that sector, not GDP. And if you work in agriculture, you probably shouldn't be surprised by this. We've seen incremental improvement year over year on climate action, but that improvement has been relatively low to other sectors. We haven't seen transformational change in terms of climate action. We've just seen kind of a continuous improvement in terms of adoption, in terms of capital flow, which could be in question in the year ahead. As well as policy and emissions have been relatively stagnant in terms of absolute emissions, particularly when you look at the NIR data. And this has a number of challenges. We're not including every action in the National Inventory Report, so there's not a ton of nuance there. But I would say what's interesting is we are seeing emissions intensity drop year over year since 2019, with the exception of the large drought year in 2021. And that improvement has really carried forward and is kind of a story in terms of producing more with less. Next slide, please. So where we're seeing the most movement on climate action within our agricultural index is really from on-farm action. And this action, what we've been able to track so far and actually see movement on, is not necessarily, again, transformative adoption in terms of nature-based solutions or other types of practices that require upfront costs. What we're seeing is action in terms of efficiency. So efficiency in terms of fertilizer use and advancements in fertilizer education, particularly around the 4Rs. Improvements in feed efficiency respective to the output of the livestock sector. And improvements in on-farm fuel use. So it has certainly fluctuated, but over the course of time, we have seen more efficient fuel use on farm, which is really the driver for what we see in the industry action pillar for the sector. Next slide, please. And I've already mentioned this, but when we look at the emissions from an absolute perspective, it's flatlined. But when you look at the intensity perspective, it is improving. And that's really going back to the fact that we're producing more with the same amount of emissions. So more with less within that regard. Next slide, please. Federal funding it has been extremely important from a climate capital perspective in the agricultural sector in Canada, particularly the On-Farm Climate Action Fund, the Living Labs, and other types of programs like the Clean Technology or Clean Agricultural Technology Program. These types of programs have really kind of kept capital afloat. We haven't seen a ton of private capital in regards to investments in agri-food. and mobilizing on-farm action. Certainly, there are growing pockets of investments in climate action through supply chain approaches. So PepsiCo has a program in Canada. RBC is committed through its RBC Generate program. And there's a number of others, like McCain's has a regenerative framework that's publicly available. There's a number of different companies that are engaged. But when you look at the publicly available data in terms of private capital investment relative to public capital investment in climate action and agriculture to date, it does certainly pale in comparison. And then when we also looked at investments in innovations, so like agricultural technologies that have a climate mitigation potential, it has certainly fluctuated over the last few years. We saw a really peak in 2021 and then fall down since then. And that capital also is quite small relative to what we've seen from public funding programs. Next slide, please. And I should also mention that with kind of the winding down of some of these types of programs, there is this risk or discussion around a capital drought within investing in climate action in agriculture. Increasingly, there's more of a focus on innovation, which certainly lends itself to climate action, but that's definitely top of mind. One opportunity that we are exploring and trying to better understand is how the Alberta MOU and the federal benchmark review of industrial carbon pricing could potentially be an opportunity for agriculture to kind of resurface itself, raise the flag in terms of an opportunity for offsets. Agriculture in Canada has had a number of challenges in terms of accessing markets, both compliance and voluntary. Broadly speaking, projects haven't been scaled for the economics to make sense. We do have a challenge in terms of a lack of know-how in terms of connecting farmers to carbon markets in Canada. And other challenges also include protocols and their applicability to the actual farm, and kind of balancing that need for accurate measurement and the realities of practice change and working with a natural ecosystem. We've seen the voluntary market scale in other jurisdictions like Brazil, the US, and the EU. And so that's kind of a challenge in terms of Canada's ability to break through. And then I would also note from a compliance market perspective, so more government regulated markets, it's very fragmented in Canada. Really, only the tier system has had notable success in terms of agricultural offset projects. In the federal offset system, there are now agricultural protocols, but that particular pathway is relatively new, and there's still opportunity for more protocols to be developed on that front, particularly the soil enrichment protocol that's under development. Next slide, please. Last year, there was lots of discussion on the carbon tax removal and what that looked like in terms of its impact on climate action in the agricultural sector. I think when we engage with farmers and we kind of understand the financial impacts of that, it's a financial relief that it's been removed. But when you look at it in terms of actual impact on greenhouse gas emissions, the carbon tax only covered roughly 3% of agricultural emissions. So it really had a very limited impact in terms of how we looked at policy that actually drives climate action in the agricultural sector. Next slide, please. So that's everything from me. Happy to answer any of your questions and engage in discussion. If you're interested in engaging with our content and trying to better understand where we're headed in terms of our research, please scan the QR code or just visit rbc.com/Climate Action Institute, and that will take you to all of our materials. And feel free to, of course, always reach out, engage with RBC.